So basically, the main aim of this discussion is that you are basically looked at the data very particularly of your own countries. So basically, the aim of this discussion is to look more closely at your countries, because what I did here in these 30 minutes, I just made a brief overview of everything. What we want to have from this small discussion is more insights of how you see the results, knowing all the circumstances and all the things of taxation, regulation, and administration in your countries. So the main aim is to where the shadow economy is coming from, and what are the experiences of different countries. So the first question I would like to ask for all of the panelists is, what were the interesting things you were really surprised of or astonished, or maybe some interesting things you could tell when you were analyzing the data of your own country? So maybe we can start from Poland.
Okay, so in Poland, for me, we had some suspicions, thanks to the survey, we were able to confirm that. In Poland, we should look at nonlinear relations. So, on average, tax wage in Poland is not that high, but it's very high for low-income workers. And when we look at the survey, we saw that people with low income were the ones that were most eager to work in shadow economy. So this was the supply of unregistered work. And on the other hand, what we know about Poland is that we have a lot of micro enterprises. They have 9 persons employed or less, and we don't know much about them. They are not fully covered by statistical analysis. They do not have to report everything. And both anecdotal data and our research indicate that they are responsible for large part of shadow economy. One reason why we have so many small companies is that working in legally in Poland is not that beneficial. For example, one of the main benefits of staying legal is that you can enforce contracts in courts. But courts in Poland work very poorly. So there's no use in signing formal contract because enforcing it will be very lengthy and costly. Furthermore, there is law in Poland is changing very rapidly and very in unpredictable way. So companies have large incentives to stay small, elastic, but at the cost of lower scale. Without benefits of scale, they are less productive. So in order to stay competitive, they engage in shadow economy. So we have this supply of workers due to high tax wage, particularly on low-income earners, and on the other hand, there is demand for shadow work by companies that want to stay in the shadow, to remain elastic, to remain to stay below the thresholds that would make them to report more. And unfortunately, everything is at the cost of the productivity, labor productivity, because there are no effects of scale, investment is low, and that's one of the biggest obstacles for economic growth in Poland at the moment.
Thank you. For Sweden, I think the most interesting was for me to see the effect of policy, because Sweden has implemented rather big tax cuts for certain sectors, construction and home services like cleaning and so on. And when you compare to how it looked before those reforms, the change is quite big. For instance, in 2006, construction, there were more people who had bought construction services than car repair. In our survey, car repairs is 2.5 times more likely to be bought than construction cleaning and those kind of domestic services even less common. So that was interesting to see that those things had quite a dramatic effect, especially since those are debated in Sweden now, and they might be rolled back. But it's also interesting to see that still those sectors are very. That when you ask if you know someone who's working in those sectors, or know someone working in the shadow economy, those sectors are still the most common, construction and so on. So there's still people working in those sectors, but maybe not towards consumers directly, or not, at least not to the consumer's knowledge. So for me, that says that if you roll back the reforms, the shadow economy will come back, because people are still doing those kind of works undeclared and but in other sectors, and so the supply is there if the demand rises.
Okay, for Estonia, I think the most interesting part for me was to see how the income from the shadow economy relates to legal income, and in this sense also this labor tax burden. Estonia has this image of being a very low tax country, which is only part true, because we have low taxes on income, but we have still relatively high taxes on labor, and the tax wage in this sense is already above the OECD average, and can be considered a good impediment to our growth. Over the past few years, it has become a large topic of this lack of labor in Estonia that is now kind of slowing down our growth. One part of it is that a lot of our workforce goes to Scandinavia on a regular basis, to Finland, to Sweden, a lot of construction workers, but also other professions. And this causes sort of this pressure on local entrepreneurs because they now have to compete for labor also with Scandinavian companies who produce a lot more value added and can sustain higher wages. In this context, it was really interesting to see that the most popular bracket for income from shadow economy in Estonia was this between 300 and 500 euros, which correlates to our minimum wage, which for 2015 was at 390 euros. So we could perhaps propose a hypothesis that people get this minimum wage for their official job, and then everything extra they kind of try to get illegally or under the table.
Okay, so thank you very much. I was pleasantly, first as a joke, I was pleasantly surprised that Belarus is included in the survey as the Baltic Sea region country, not as the part of the Russian world, which is good news. So what I was surprised to see low figures for financial intermediation and consultancy as the way to minimize taxation. I was surprised to see the social distribution when it comes to less socially protected people, women, younger and rural population justifying the work in those activities much more. I was a bit surprised by seeing that let's say the purchases of alcohol, tobacco are similar to the other countries, whereas Belarus often stands as the country which exports those things to the neighboring countries, not consumes itself, because those prices are heavily subsidized in Belarus. The same goes with, for example, fuel. So those are the main things I say I was surprised mostly. I was surprised by the fact that although Belarus economy is structurally totally different from what we're seeing elsewhere, it's not only that there is a different structure of the economic regime, it's a different structure of political regime, it's also a completely different structure of the state. Despite that, we have comparable data from which we could draw certain conclusions. I'll speak about it a bit later, if you please. Thank you.
I would like also for you to follow up, because I was also looking very carefully at the Belarus data. It was very, very interesting for me to compare it, especially with Sweden or with Lithuania. And one of the questions was for me is, and maybe that might be a silly question, but how much we can really say that this data is reliable? How do we have any to believe that people were answering the question less honestly in your country than the other countries. Especially one of the reasons why I'm asking that, for example, was that actually when we asked the question how people value the government services of different countries, Belarus was one of the highest. Actually, the score of it was one of the highest. So, do you have any comment on this?
We're strange people. That's the main comment to say. Honestly, there's a long debate to what extent you could rely sociological data. In Belarus, some argue that there is a big fear factor, namely people would be very careful and cautious when somebody calls you and asks the question, how do you trust the government? Of course, it might be a best win-win strategy to say, yes, of course I do. On the other hand, I mean, let's discount a bit for this aberration, but at the same time, I think data is reliable. I think what is mostly important to understand about Belarus is that the state itself, there is no real market upholding state in the Weberian sense in Belarus. Namely, the state here is rather an entrepreneur itself, and in Belarus, I would probably say that the public authorities and the state is being rather financed from the rent coming outside of the country. So in this case, this is a rather rentier state than the state living of the surplus production of its population. So in this regard, the fiscal contract, the argument from the fiscal sociology, no representation without taxation, is a bit different. People are using public services which are not necessarily financed, and they know it, from their taxes, but they are rather financed from the incomes which the state makes through, let's say, asymmetrical relations with Russia. It was this old metaphor for hugs and kisses in return for oil and gas. And now when the oil and gas is declining in price, the structure of the price for kisses and hugs remains the same. But nonetheless, so in this regard, it's very hard. It's a quasi-social system in which the workers pretend that they're working for the state. In Belarus, the level of unemployment is extremely low, simply because the state pays the salaries for the workers just to go to pretend that they're working. Because when they don't go and when they don't pretend that they're working, they might be politically dangerous, or there might be some collective action organized for that. So those peculiarities, the lack of the market upholding state, strong longue durée factors, long bad inheritance from the Soviet system, where you would rather try to cheat the state by using blood networks, by using barter, by going into gray because this is your main surviving strategy, and because the state is your enemy there and your task is more or less to cheat on the state. That to a big extent remained in Belarus, where people become the consumers of state services which they are not paying for. So that affects the tax moral argument quite a lot, I believe.
Thanks, it was very interesting. So the second question I would like to pose to the panelists, the second part of our conference today, we're going to dedicate to talking about more on the strategies on how to fight shadow economy and how to solve this problem, basically. But in order to do something effectively, you firstly have to understand the reasons behind shadow economy. So the second question would be, what would be, in the case of goods and services and also in the case of shadow economy, what would be the key drivers of shadow economy in your country that you would like to specifically tell as the most important?
Okay, so before, as I already mentioned, in Poland we have a lot of these micro enterprises that are responsible for a large extent of shadow economy. And in order to answer the question why they are so small, we looked at the main reasons, main obstacles to growth in different studies. We will run a survey of more than 10 different researches on obstacles to growth, and the companies in Poland indicated mainly tax code, not the tax rates, but the complications and often changes in tax code that make any planning unpredictability of tax code makes any planning very hard. And also, as I already, we looked at the experiences of other countries where the small size of companies was connected with the efficiency of courts, when the costs are not efficient, you rather stay small and do business with people you know, instead of going into business contracts with people you don't know, you don't trust, because you don't have the courts to enforce contracts in case of any problems. So knowing about these problems, we think that these are the main factors that push companies into shadow economy, and also there are some particular things, like, for example, thresholds above which you have to, for example, you have to switch from simplest tax simplified tax code to normal tax code. Or, for example, you have to register your workers more in details. So companies bundle just below these two thresholds just to stay below the radar of public service, public authorities.
Thanks. Obviously, taxes in Sweden is important, especially with the marginal taxes for those kind of services that I mentioned, that you as a private person pays with your tax salary. So, and if you have marginal taxes of 60%, then that will be quite expensive to buy a service from someone else, who then in turn need to pay VAT and of 25%, and then their taxes as well. That said, those services, the deductions from construction and house cleaning and so on, they didn't really take off until we made it really easy to buy them. First time you needed to keep your receipts and send them into the tax office, and then they had to process it, and then you got your money back. But it wasn't until you got the money in advance, so you took the deduction off the bill immediately, and took all the paperwork off the consumers. That the market really got going there in those sectors. So bureaucracy is quite an important driver as well. I would also like to mention third-party information about taxes. If the bank or the employer, if the employer sends the information directly to the tax authorities, and they have all your data on your income, then it's fairly difficult for you to avoid taxes. And as an example, in Sweden, 10% of Swedes they pay their taxes. They get they just acknowledge their taxes via an SMS. So they say, yes, the tax authority says it's all right, and much higher percentage they don't do any alterations at all of what the tax authorities say. So it's quite difficult to avoid if you have a third party system when you don't declare yourself, so to say. I think that's important reason why the shadow economy is smaller in Sweden. And also from I think we missed a little bit of that in our survey, for the simple reasons that we our survey was in Swedish, and I believe that quite a lot of the shadow employment is made by people who doesn't speak Swedish. The unemployment for Swedes is 3%, and the unemployment for Swedes being born outside of Europe is 25% or so, and even higher for those who arrived more recently. And Professor Snyder mentioned unemployment as a key driver, and I think that's important as well. But I don't think we didn't really catch that in our survey. We have only had 3% working in the shadow, who admit that they worked in the shadow economy.
In Estonia, actually, we have a similar situation to Sweden in regard to labor taxes, as we have this three-way system, and the worker himself is rather passive in this part. So it's not easy to avoid these taxes. But still, some research has shown that some workers kind of approach their employer already with a wish to get paid in cash, and sort of, I suppose that shadow agreements can be made in this agreement that the company doesn't report everything. In regard to purchasing goods and services, it was clear from our survey that for Estonia the biggest issue is the level of prices, and hence also is taxes, VAT and other consumption taxes, which perhaps in some sense is still sort of this recent reaction in people's minds, because during the recession Estonia increased VAT by 2 percentage points. So perhaps there is some reaction still in that, why people see it as the most important issue. But also, I guess they simply there is a lot of comparison in regard to prices, how they are seen in Estonia and how they show up, for example, in Scandinavia, and people don't really see much difference in this sense. That in this context, they consider Estonia to be very expensive, and perhaps there's this conclusion that the taxes are high. But this also relates to only one part of the market, because real estate and something, that kind of stuff that people, perhaps tourists and who go to Scandinavia not very often, don't realize that in Scandinavia real estate and some other things are a lot more expensive. So there might be some discrepancy in this regard.
So when it comes to this correlation between unemployment and the size of the shadow economy in Belarus, the official unemployment rate is less than 2%, but again, we should really be careful with this data. The fact that, first of all, the statistic reflects only those who are officially registered on within the state authorities dealing with the unemployment, and second of all, this is because of the soft budget constraints which are still paid for the insolvent enterprises to keep the employment going. When it comes to taxes, in certain things the taxes are low, but at the same time when it comes to the taxation for hiring a worker, it would be overall 54%. That you will pay over the salary if you want to hire one person. So many of the companies prefer to, let's say, use the semi-legal, or it's a very thin line between what is shadow economy and not here, because if you're using some sort of perfectly legal ways to minimize taxation, like using the individual entrepreneurs where the company will pay 0 and the individual entrepreneur you hire to do certain work will pay overall 5%. So again, it's different.
Maybe we have questions from the audience. That will be very welcome. Any questions? Yeah, one here. Yeah, there.
Hello, my name is Yaroslav Fremenchuk. I'm from Belarus, Minsk Mises Center. One reflection on Belarus and the methodology. Thing is that the system is highly centralized, and I think you can trust polling, but it's very difficult to target the exact sources of gray economy activities. As you know, the centralization of decision-making in Belarus and resource control is off the radar of any polling service, including the state one. That's why what Alexei says is that whatever data you have is for the people who are polled, but not the people who are exactly part of the gray economy. We did our own estimation, and the size of the gray economy in broad definition is over 50% of GDP, no doubt about it, because no matter, I've been doing with business for a long time, and if like you import one thing legally and you sell 10 illegally, so in some estimates, my colleagues from business believe that the size is about 80%. But my question is not about Belarus, but about the evaluation or estimation of the distinguished panelists of one important thing. Based on what is going on in Russia and Ukraine and Belarus to a lesser extent, how do you see the long-term political and security costs of gray economy being out of control and not being handled by free market economic policy? Thank you.
Okay. So we can also maybe get the second question and then try on both of these. This is here in the first row.
I have one specific question on smuggling in Belarus, also considering the last statement. I was really amazed that smuggling is so much disliked, or people say this is a bad thing. Is it because the quality, let's say, of black produced or smuggled alcohol is so poor? Is that sometimes even people die of this? Is this one aspect? Or why is it so? And then I would have an opinion from all panelists. You saw the figures on shadow economy estimate in percent of GDP. It's a rough thing, yeah? With 10%, 9%, the lowest, up to 30% in Belarus. Would you think for your country, especially for the Baltic countries, and considering, for example, Poland versus Lithuania, with double the size in Poland, you think this is plausible, or is left something out here?
Okay, so we have some questions. I think we could start with Belarus, because I also saw that actually the justification of excise duty things or of smuggling and alcohol and cigarettes was the lowest actually in Belarus. So maybe that would be first question to reflect on, and then we'll continue with the second two questions for all the panelists.
Still, I mean, this is the question which is very hard to answer to myself as well, because I'm also a bit surprised with interpreting that figure. So it perhaps, as it requires an additional analysis, it perhaps could be that it's linked with the quality of those goods. Perhaps that could be linked with the way that Belarus is the exporter of those goods. Let's say, I mean, there were certain estimates that up to from 30 to 50%, for example, of cigarettes illegally sold here in Lithuania came here from Belarus. Very hard. I mean, I wouldn't be able to answer this question exactly right now from the data that we saw. In my opinion, it requires additional interpretation.
So the other two questions were which were for all the panelists. So basically, as I understood it correctly, long-term consequences of shadow economy problem being untackled. So this is what were your reflections on that? And actually, also, do you have any reflections about the numbers that we are proposing you? Do you think what is the feeling about the numbers? Are we missing something out? Are they correct, or this is something underestimated or overestimated?
Regarding the first question, I see the main challenge in untackled shadow economy in Poland in terms of GDP growth. In Poland, we need more investment. Investment rate in Poland is among the lowest in the region, and companies staying in shadow economy have problems with taking credit, with investing. So this is one thing. And the second thing, as I already mentioned, is the scale of production. Staying small means that you don't have economies of scale. And without investment and economies of scale, you don't have labor productivity growth, without which we will not have wage growth and economic growth. So this is one thing. And the other thing, when we look at the distribution of companies in Poland with regard to their labor productivity, we see huge dispersion among the biggest in the region. So on the market in Poland, we have companies that are very productive and very unproductive. And market mechanisms do not work. The low productivity companies are not eliminated. So this is one aspect of shadow economy. They can stay afloat because they are partly staying in shadow economy. So we have a huge problem with working off markets because of allocation of efficiency of allocation of resources because of the shadow economy. And if these figures for Poland are okay, I have some problems with them, because on the one hand we see that in Poland the percentage of people working in shadow economy is comparable or even higher than in Baltic countries. So we have huge activity in the shadow economy. But on the other hand, people do not report buying in shadow economy. So people are producing something, and what's going on with these, with outcomes of their production? I think that the part of the answer is that Poland is a bigger country, and we don't have such so much smuggling and so on. Our borders are quite far away, so smuggling and buying smuggled products, I think, is inflating shadow economy estimates in Baltics, and in Poland it's less visible. But when we look at this employment side, we see that the size of a shadow economy is quite similar.
Thanks. For Sweden, I would say that the threat of the shadow economy is for the financing of the welfare state. It's necessary to have to improve taxation to be able to for the welfare state to continue. But regarding the biggest threats are, I think, the ones that Professor Snyder mentioned is outside of the shadow economy, like the real crime and organized crime and so on, which is, I mean, it's a gray zone between with smuggling and so on, which, I mean, of course, it's if there is a big market for smuggling and alcohol and cigarettes and so on, then of course that will increase the level of crime and the level of organized crime, and that might be a bigger threat, I would say. Regarding the figures, I would have imagined that the figures would have been a little bit lower. I've seen the trends of the macro estimates, which have been lowered a little bit, but not much more than other countries. And Sweden has, I think, is the country or one of the countries that's been lowering taxes most for the last 10 years. And also it's been quite a lot of micro initiatives, to a few that I mentioned, and also making it more difficult for smaller shops to avoid taxes and so on. And if you look at the figures, the number of people who mentioned that they know someone who's working in the shadow economy has been halved in 10 years. And people saying that they know an entrepreneur who's working in the shadow economy, it's down by 2/3 in the last 10 years. So it's been quite a lot of some indications that it should be lower. Then on the other hand, given the high unemployment of certain groups, that should on the other hand make it more that it should be higher. So it's difficult to assess. Two forces in different directions there.
Okay, the long-term threat of shadow economy for Estonia. Well, there has been research showing that the shadow economy in Estonia, in general terms, is getting smaller year by year. In part, this has to do with our tax office being very hard at work, at getting workers registered and catching tax fraud and all this usual stuff. But I would say that the more important part here has been the general rise in wealth of people. Because as we see, there is a very strong correlation between the economic growth and the size of the shadow economy. As the economy grows and people get wealthier, they move more towards purchasing legal goods. Also, as the service showed, then for Estonia, people are sort of this justification for shadow economy is very small compared to other Baltic countries, and is actually closer to Sweden in this sense. So we could say that the Estonians have this relatively high moral approach in this sense. And although they don't see punishments and getting caught to be very risky, very hard, they don't see hard punishments or high risk in getting caught, they still are sort of this morally against the shadow economy in principle. Bigger threats in regard to the shadow economy, of course, is the economic well-being. As we saw during the crisis, as our economy fell fast for a few years, the shadow economy also went up a bit. But more generally, there have been, when we go into more details in the shadow economy, for example, in regard to these excise goods, then we can see that when the government raises excises very fast, and this decline in shadow economy goes away, and actually, in some respects, even the shadow market starts to grow, which has been the case for alcohol in the past years. In regard to more organized crime, there is, of course, this threat from Russia in a sense that Estonia is sort of this gateway for Russian drug trafficking and that kind of stuff, which, of course, the police and customs are working very hard against it, but this probably can never be eliminated completely. But I wouldn't say it's a big threat in general in this sense. In regard to the numbers proposed, what we learned from this survey, the results seemed fairly similar to other research that has been done in Estonia. So I guess this, in general percentage terms of the GDP, various researchers tend to fall between this 10-15% range of GDP. I guess in this sense, this survey was in the ballpark, definitely. But of course, there are aspects that can't be followed very closely. Also, when the tax and customs board sort of puts out their own statistics, how much tax fraud they have got, and some estimates would say that the amount they have got would show that they have eliminated tax fraud completely, which of course is impossible. Yeah, thank you.
When speaking about the trends, we should perhaps understand that the 5 other cases we're talking about are more or less stable cases where market transition, consolidation of capitalism is over. Belarus is the country where the hybrid socialist mixed economy is frozen, the transition has been stalled, and as long as the trend develops, this transition is yet to come. So the trend for Belarus would be very turbulent times where the state will lose its functionality, clearly, because it wouldn't be able to sustain itself with the flow of the external windfall profits from Russia. That used to be up to 22% of its GDP, which the country received from Russia, from Russian energy, from the administrative access to Russian market. This is something which is very likely to be broken, and the market reforms, the structural reforms are, at the end of the day, inevitable. Now, when this happens, and this is paradoxical, the gray economy, shadow economy would be an amortization tool for the population to survive in the short-term horizon. So inevitably it will rise, but this is I would say, of course, shadow economy is bad, but at the same time here it's inevitable, and this would be the surviving strategy and the safety net for certain people. So this is, this is the trend. So in Belarus it will, of course, expand with the growth of the unemployment, with the fact that the Russian market is not anymore able to absorb Belarusian workers who simply stopped going there. Once you lose your job in Belarus, you used to go to work in Moscow for the construction. Now it just doesn't make sense with the crisis in the Russian market. And even those who went there, up to, let's say, 250,000, they are coming back with completely different perspectives. They will have to be economically engaged. So that would be the growth, but I wouldn't see this, the potential and the future growth and the expansion of the shadow economy in Belarus as just negative. It has its own surviving meaning for the population.
What about the estimates? Do you see any sense in calling people in Belarus or not? So do you think these estimates are somewhat valuable?
Estimates of what?
Of shadow economy that we're providing, or the professor or someone else is providing?
Of course, this is a good estimate for what people think about those things. Of course. This is the proximity that gets us a bit closer to understanding the case.
We have any more questions from the audience, maybe? You have earphones here, or we can translate. Maybe someone would translate the question. I will translate it.
Labadiena, Šalių universitetas, Rita Toleikienė. Aš atkreipiau dėmesį į pranešėjų, į tokį klausimą pranešėjų. Tai yra?
So I'll try to translate it.
Tai, kad Švedijoje yra mažiausios bausmės, ar nekalbant apie šešėlinę ekonomiką. Ir mažiausia yra šešėlinė ekonomika. Aš norėčiau suvesti tai, kad bausmės koreliacija su pačia ar ne nusikaltimu šešėlinė ekonomika nekoreliuoja. Tai reiškia, kad yra dar viena priežastis, kuri galbūt šiame tyrime neaptarta, bet galbūt perspektyvoje gali būti aptarti, tai yra moralinis apsisprendimas arba, kaip profesorius sakė, moraliniai mokesčiai ar ne, moralės klausimas. Tai yra pačios kultūros nuostatos. Galbūt būtų įdomu, kad kiti oponentai padiskutuotų apie tai.
Okay, so basically the comment here and also partly a question was that Sweden is a very interesting case because it has the perception of punishment is very low for the shadow economy activities, but at the same time shadow economy is low. So that means that we are overlooking some other factors, so punishment does not really tell the whole story. We have to incorporate many other things, and one of these things is of course tax morale. So maybe you can comment on this. How do you see this problem? And maybe other panelists can comment about this issue connection between punishment, how unavoidable it is, and what is the tax morale level in your country?
Okay, that's a good question. I think I would say two things about that. One is that this, of course, connected to what you perceive that you receive from the government, and if you believe that the quality of the schools and quality of the health service and so on is good, then of course the morale is higher, and you're more willing to pay taxes, and you consider people who do not pay taxes and who do not participate to be bad people. And I think that's one of the reasons for the welfare states that we've been able to have a welfare state. Is that for quite long time, long before the welfare state, there were a perception that the services from the government were fairly good, and the corruption was fairly low, so to say. So that was a prerequisite so the tax morale came before the welfare state, so to say. On the other hand, it didn't used to be like this. There's a famous quote from, I think it's the late 70s, from Gunnar Myrdal, who's a famous economist of Sweden, who said that the tax system of Sweden made the Swedes the people of crooks and villains, because all we did was try to avoid the tax system of sometimes smuggler taxes above 100%. So and if you look at the data from then, the shadow economy has been it is much smaller now, because everybody realized that this was you couldn't do this. The tax morale was going away. People tried to avoid taxes, and I mean the economy wasn't working. So I think that the tax morale as well is a result of the reforms from the last 30 years, when we've been trying to make the system more effective and take to lower the taxes where it's needed. So that's I think that's one reason for it.
Okay, you have any more comments about the connection with tax morale and shadow economy?
In Poland, I would only comment that I think that currently the bigger problem is the perception and, in fact, probability of being caught than the size of the punishment, because punishment are quite severe. Knowledge about this is also quite popular, but the system of control and the probability of being caught is really low. So this is the area where we should do more.
Okay. So a little bit maybe on the positive note, do you have any experiences of really government having successful measures on how to tackle the problem of shadow economy? Maybe some examples, especially with incentive-based measures in your countries, because we were talking about shadow economy, how difficult it is, where it comes from, but maybe there are examples of good experiences in your country you could share with us, and it would be very useful for our later discussion that we're going to have.
unfortunately, in Poland, for the last few years, we had no major policy actions against shadow economy. The main topic in this area, or somewhere there, is gap in value-added tax, but this is mainly due to tax fraud, so mainly carousel fraud, and not necessarily shadow economy. So our revenue services are currently mainly targeting the frauds and not thinking about shadow economy at the moment. But I think that once we get past the carousel fraud, then we will start to think about other factors, like, for example, shadow economy. I think that currently the taxation of low-income workers is highly on political agenda, and I hope that some changes in this area will be introduced, but it's not connected with the talk about shadow economy. This will be the reduction of shadow economy will be by effect of other other reasons behind such changes.
I should mention that I worked for the last government, so I'm not impartial really. Talking about the effect of the policies, but as I mentioned before, the subsidies of construction and house cleaning and so on, I think that's has worked quite well. So it's a subsidy of the government basically pays half the bill of the labor cost, so of the repair or the cleaning. And up to a threshold which is above what most people spend on it anyway. So that's been so it's both been a way to tackle the shadow economy, but also to transform unpaid work to paid work, which is important for a country with so high marginal taxes as we have. But I talked about them before, so I will dwell on them more.
For Estonia, there is a positive development, perhaps kind of relates to this previous question on tax moral. As we saw, then Estonians also tend to see the punishments to be rather lenient, or they don't consider them very hard. But this has to be considered in the context that the Estonians tend to see their entire legal system to be rather lenient on criminals, and the punishment system isn't considered to be very hard. So in this sense, Estonians tend to have a high moral, as also was seen in the question on justification of shadow economy. Another part also is that our tax office has been very effective in this sense, and kind of with having people and businesses reporting their dealings in the economy. Just recently, Estonia's tax office was rated to be one of the most efficient in the OECD. But this doesn't only relate to this question of forcing people to comply, but also how the tax office has actually innovated in a sense of creating online services that it is very easy to report your taxes, declare everything, and you don't have to go through a lot of bureaucracy. It has been estimated that, for example, declaring your, let's say, value-added taxes, this online system has saved up to 10 times in spent time in filling the form and reporting it to the tax office. Most of this paperwork and declaring has been eliminated, and the tax office is still trying to develop these systems even further.
Perhaps one innovation, one Belarusian know-how, which shouldn't be quoted as a good know-how, but at the same time it's worth a mention, would be the so-called Decret o tuniectve, named that when copying the Soviet practice that when you are unemployed that there could be some administrative or even criminal punishment. Right now in Belarus, if you're unemployed for a certain amount of months and you didn't manage to find a job, then you have to pay taxes anyway. So basically a housewife sitting home her husband will have to pay for her stay home and for her being unemployed. That was initially made to target those cities, those people living in the regions who are mostly involved in the cross-border trade, smuggling, things like this, who don't see any motivation to get employed otherwise because they earn much more from those activities than any legal contract would give them in the time. But this is the bizarre practice which I urge you not to copy.
Have one question from Professor.
Let me provoke you a bit. I think you talk much too little that a shadow economy has also a lot of positive effects or is welfare enhancing. If you take a liberal economic position, one should really more seriously ask, why are people doing this? I always say, oh, this bad government, I have to punish them. Or do they not simply have to have a better standard of living, are dissatisfied with some government activities and say, look, if I do not get from my taxpayers' money or my taxpayers' money is wasted, at least this is a big issue in Germany and Austria, yeah? For what it is spent, whether people have a say for what it is spent, then people say, well, no, I don't declare my extra hours and I work in the shadow economy. And regardless what you think of these figures of mine, whether they are crazy or not, if you take them by half or take a third of them, this proportion is welfare enhancing for every of these countries here. And I think we should take this seriously too. Yeah? If at least I'm taking a liberal standpoint in economics, one should really see people are active, people are doing something, they don't commit a crime like robbing a bank or drug dealing or something. They're doing something very useful for other people too. And I think this aspect can't be neglected when discussing this. And I really think there that punishment may be, in some aspects, when it's organized to crime, the right thing. But in all other areas, maybe, and I say it provocatively, utterly wrong. There should be an incentive to do this in the official economy. So what is your opinion on this?
No, it's a very good point. I agree, and I think the prevalence of the shadow economy also is a measurement of how well the system is working. If the taxes are too high, then you get a lot of people working in the shadow economy, and that of course. The good thing about that is it gives the government incentives to tackle those problems, to lower marginal taxes, for example, or to make special arrangements for those kind of sectors. In the best way is, of course, to make broad measures that is not as targeted as they normally are. But I think it's at least better when you do focus on that you see that there is a problem with the system if you have a large shadow economy, and then that forces the government to do something about it. Then, of course, there is the negative side of the shadow economy, which I think Sweden is heading at, is where there's a large part of the population that is not allowed for some reasons to enter the regular market because of the too high minimum wages, for instance, or too much regulations that they can't compete. And then, of course, it's better for them to work in the shadow economy than not working at all. But I don't think it's not a very good society where it's one group is outside and another group is inside. That is a problem that I think we'll heading at and that we need to work more with.
One strong conclusion I would draw from this survey on Estonia was that I think we could see from this data clearly that for Estonia there's a question on when people get involved in shadow economy, what are the reasons, is that it's simply because of their own well-being. when they are poorer, or perhaps students who are only entering the labor market, then it's really hard to comply with all the regulations like minimum wages and so forth. And so this shadow economy is actually their way to get involved in the economy in the first place.
I think we have time for one more question, if anybody has. Yeah.
Definitely I welcome the liberal agenda approach and people's participation in the grey economy if it's a challenge to the government. But let me emphasize one important tool that European Union brings on us and that generates grey economy and state capture. And I talked to my colleagues in Ukraine and Moldova, and one of the requirements of joining or signing the association agreement is having VAT in compliance with EU standards. In Ukraine, the monthly extortion of VAT from the budget is about $4 billion. The only country that doesn't have the problem of VAT extortion, guess is Belarus. That's about the calculation of grey economy in our country. And so when we welcome people's participation and value generation in societies and in economies, I would consider the importance of different taxes and the nature of taxes and institutions that come from the West and corrupt, first of all, nomenclature and politicians, and they, as a result, generate hybrid systems that are far from being liberal, and this kind of corrosive effect on
what is your question? Can you pose a question here? Because
okay, so the comment. The question is, do you see the responsibility of EU institutions in generating grey economy and black market in emerging countries which are institutionally much weaker?
Okay. Any reflections on that?
Well, I wouldn't say that it has to do necessarily with institutions, but more with economic geography. Because in Estonia alone, we see that our smaller regions have problems with sort of having this well-being because they are small and there is no effect of economics of scale. The same applies to Estonia in general, because a lot of these goods that are brought in Estonia are sometimes even more expensive than in Europe, which also explains why clothes are so popular as a purchasing item in the shadow economy. And I think that applies to the entire Baltic region, that as we are geographically on this fringe of the European Union, then this all this push towards the elimination of tax competition really hurts us and puts on us a lot of new challenges.
Anybody else? Okay, so I think it's very difficult to draw conclusions from this panel. I mean, because we have a lot of different things, and shadow economy is really a complex thing. Two main things that I wrote down for myself, which are interesting, is first of all the philosophical question of justice. What is really justice? Is working in a shadow economy unjust or unjustified, or is, for example, having 40 or 50% on your labor, the taxation, is that maybe unjust? So this is a very interesting question, philosophical question on what is injustice and justice in shadow economy. The other thing, which I think is very important for another part of our conference, is to understand that in order to reduce shadow economy, we not only have to think of how to make the life bad for those who work in shadow economy, but also how to make life easy for those who are working legally. So this is, I think, very important takeaway for our next part of our conference. Thank you very much for the panel, and see you after break.